As some of you may remember, a while ago I made a video response to Dr. Lehman's video response to Computing Forever's video response to Sargon of Akkad. He then made a video response to my video response to his video response, and that's where it ended. Well, I don't like the fact that it ended. I enjoyed it so much that I want to do it again. So this time I'm doing a video response to his video response to Armored Skeptic. Last time, the argument was around the nature of Marxism. This time we are discussing postmodernism. I have some criticism of what Skeptic and Lehman had to say on the issue, but mainly I want to talk about what postmodernism is. So this is round 2 of Serpent vs. Lehman. Let's see if Babylon shall prevail. So, the last time we did this was when Dr. Lehman criticized Dave Cullen's characterization of Marxism, and generally objected to the term cultural Marxism. I made a video response to Lehman, and pointed out that we can define some SJW ideas as cultural Marxism, since they evolved out of Marxism, albeit by vulgarizing it. Lehman was very happy with my video, because apparently it was the first video response he ever got, and responded with a video in which he basically accepted my argument, but pointed out that what I was talking about was neo-Marxism. I was very happy with his video, because this was the first response video I ever got, and I basically accept his argument, although I would point out that every neo-Marxist I ever met claims that they are the real Marxists, whereas classical Marxists fail to evolve with the times. But those are semantics. I will leave links to this discussion below, and I suggest you watch it. The reason why I think it is important that you watch it is that neo-Marxism and postmodernism are the two systems of thought that are most influential on today's regressive left, which means that all anti-SJWs should be familiar with them. Unfortunately, the writings of Marxists and postmodernists are very hard to understand, even to those of us who are well versed in philosophy. YouTube skeptics therefore rely on others to explain it to them, and many of the sources that they rely on do not do justice with these systems of thought, and just try to denigrate them. Lehman and myself do our best to try to explain it in a way that will give you an idea of what they are about. We did it for neo-Marxism. Now let's do it for postmodernism. What sparked this debate was a video made by Armored Skeptic, titled What is Postmodernism? Armored Skeptic, whose real name is Gregory Führer. Führer? That can't be right. Armored Skeptic. I will let him explain what prompted him to make the video. Take it away, mein Führer.
In the last episode of Skeptic Explains, I asked for you to write questions for me to answer in the comments section, and one of the examples that I gave was, what is postmodernism? Now I realize this isn't fair, and it wasn't exactly the most popular question that I got, but lots of you did ask that exact question. So, what is postmodernism?
From here, the Armored One goes on to give an 11-minute summary of postmodernism, as he understands it. Considering it is meant to be just a short overview, the video isn't terrible, but I am not sure it will advance your knowledge of postmodernism beyond what you probably know already, or think you know. I have nothing to add to Dr. Lehman's criticism of it, although I am not as harsh as he is, for reasons I will shortly discuss. But he mostly just tells you what is wrong with Greg's video, without fully explaining what postmodernism is. Now, postmodernism is a term that covers a lot of fields, but both Skeptic and Lehman agree that the important aspect of it is a philosophical one. Philosophy is my field, so I guess it falls on me to once and for all set the record straight on postmodernism. I will use Dr. Lehman's video as my starting point, but then, prepare yourselves, because we are going deep. Lehman begins by ceding that Greg's videos are more well made than his. I think that is an important thing to point out. We are on YouTube, and YouTube is an art/entertainment medium, so videos are ultimately judged by their entertainment value. Even when I make a philosophical vid like this, I always try to find ways to make it more entertaining. And so does Dr. Lehman. I doubt he would be using that voice of his if he was giving a lecture in the academy. Greg was not handing in a dissertation, he was making a YouTube video, so I'm not going to roast him for being superficial. His channel is much more popular than mine or Lehman's, which shows that most people prefer his more lightweight and populist approach. Those of us who want deeper discussions should regard it as a good start of a conversation, and use this opportunity to have it. And I think Greg would do well if he sent his viewers to watch these discussions. Now, as I mentioned, postmodernist philosophy is very hard to understand. One reason why it is so hard to understand is that most postmodernist philosophers are French, and French philosophers of the 20th century all fancied themselves poets. They can't help but wax poetical in every paragraph they write, and they often do it at the expense of clarity. It's not just the postmodernists. The French existentialists and structuralists had the same problem. It's really annoying. Like I said, I try to be entertaining in my videos, and also in my writing, but when I discuss an idea, I try to be as clear as possible. But that is not how the French roll, so I don't blame you if you don't read them. Luckily for you, I am here to do the dirty work. There are other reasons why postmodernism is hard to understand, but the claim that I sometimes hear from its detractors, the claim that it is all just gibberish, is itself gibberish. Yes, a lot of the things that are being written today under the title of postmodernism are nonsensical rubbish, but when it comes to its major thinkers, it has a lot of merit. Here I am going to define postmodernism by its two main philosophers, namely Foucault and Lyotard. But let's begin by watching a bit of Dr. Lehman's video.
People were no longer driven by their identity based on religion, and they were now driven by identifying with other concepts like patriotism, capitalism, communism, fascism. Knowledge was expanding, the world was mapped, technologies were improving life, society was becoming more organized and institutionalized, art was challenging conventions, and it also brought concepts like the American dream. Modernism had turned into a unified concept of progress and development through logic and scientific endeavor. Modernism led to great achievements like the moon landing. Wait, no, that was a hoax. The idea was institutions knew best.
Greg, stop. I mean, okay, listen. This part, up until now, even including the philosophers, wasn't too bad. Sure, a few nitpicks here and there, but meh, who cares, right? Who cares? But you just dropped the ball. Really hard. Modernism is anti-everything. Everything you just described, Greg. Wherever you go in terms of modernism, the one thing it always has in common is a rejection of logic, objective truth, and science. I mean, if you look at some of the most prominent pieces of modern art, this actually should be pretty evident. This quote-unquote movement then exploded after the First World War because, well, it's a rejection of reason and logic, and how else do you handle the up until then worst war ever? These nightmarish experiences of the First World War intensified the modernist rejection of realism, rationalism, and logic even more. I genuinely don't know where anyone can get the idea from that modernism was some kind of golden age of rational and scientific thought. It's the complete opposite, actually.
When I informed Dr. Lehman that I'm going to respond to his video, he immediately guessed that I'm going to focus on this part. You see, Skeptic and Lehman argue about the nature of modernism here. But I remind you that we are talking about philosophy, and in philosophy, when we talk about postmodernism, we are not talking about postmodernism. We are talking about postmodernism. Got it? No? Okay, let's elaborate. We have to discern between modern and modernism. The idea is that until around the 1970s, we have been living in the modern age. In Michel Foucault's classification, the modern era began in the late 18th century, and the era before that is what he calls the classical age, beginning in the mid-17th century. Every one of these eras had a paradigm, which determined how people thought and acted. I will elaborate a bit more about paradigms later, but the important thing to remember is that when we are part of an era, we are not fully aware of the paradigm that controls us. The paradigm determines things that we see as matter of fact and common sense, and only when we are out of the paradigm can we see that they are not matter of fact at all, but structures that rule our society and our minds. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, people started to realize that they are living in the modern age, and artists and thinkers started to react to the modern world in all sorts of ways. In the beginning of the 20th century, this movement started to call itself modernism. Modernism ruled the art world for decades, but in the 1960s, some artists felt that it has run its course, and started to create art which they called postmodernist, going against some of the tenets of modernism. In the 1970s, the term postmodernism was picked up by philosophers, but in their case, it wasn't about going against the modernist movement. The basic claim of postmodernist philosophy is that the entire paradigm of the modern age has collapsed, and we are now in a new age. One of Dr. Leymann's main criticisms is that Armored Skeptic made it seem like modernism was about embracing science, logic, and rationality, and the ideals of enlightenment. He points out that a big part of the modernist movement actually turned against these ideals. That is true. It's part of a bigger point he is making, which is that Greg is generalizing about the movements he talks about, and treating them like a monolith when in fact they have lots of contradicting forces. That is of course correct. However, whether they were for or against science, rationality, and so forth, modernists all have one thing in common. They were all working within the modern paradigm. And that is why I have less of a problem with this part of Greg's video than Leymann does. His characterizations of modernism and postmodernism may be wrong, but if we apply them to the modern age and the postmodern age, they come closer to the mark. So, to understand postmodernism, we first of all need to talk about the earlier paradigms. The presentation I will give now will be done in very general terms. I just want us to understand the principle. So let's begin by talking about what Foucault called the Classical Age. In the Classical Age, the paradigm was that the universe is ruled by divine order, and that the human mind is capable of grasping that order. The rationalists and the empiricists may have disagreed on the way to get there, but they were both driven by the idea that man needs to find his place inside the divine order, and arrange his world accordingly. And while monarchs claimed that the divine order put them on top, the philosophers of enlightenment claimed that to fit the divine order, society should be rearranged around the ideals of freedom and equality. Around the end of the 18th century, the classical paradigm collapsed. Why? Well, the question of when and why a paradigm collapses is one of the questions that postmodernism deals with, so we shall leave it for later. For now, let's just say that thinkers could no longer believe that our mind is capable of grasping the order of the universe, and that man is capable of arranging society in a perfect way. Instead, they started claiming that man is not ready for it yet. He needs to grow and learn more before he can create a perfect world. The modern paradigm was based on the idea of progress. More importantly than exploring nature, man needs to explore himself. It is a gradual process in which man learns about himself and creates better systems based on that knowledge, systems that help him get greater knowledge of himself. The end of the road will be the formation of a perfect society and the liberation of man. So, if you ever wondered why the human sciences were only born in the 19th century, Foucault answers, because we were driven to it by the modern paradigm. In the classical age, when the paradigm dictated that man should find his place in the divine order, there was no point in exploring man, but only in exploring nature to find the divine order. Once the paradigm changed and dictated that man needs to explore himself in order to grow up to the point where he can devise a perfect world, the need for human sciences arose. And the idea that man is a being that grows through history led to other ideas, like Darwin's theory of evolution. It also led to the idea that if there is something wrong with man, it is because something went wrong during his growth, which led for instance to Freud's theory that all of our psychological problems are the result of things that happen in early childhood. All of these theories became possible only after the modern paradigm was established, and directed our thoughts towards these paths. The paradigm is not something that we are fully aware of, but it directs our thoughts, and we are all controlled by it. If we go back to Dr. Leymann's point that a lot of modern thinkers and artists rejected science and rationalism, we will have to say that that is true, but even they still thought in terms of progress towards a perfect society. They just thought that rationality and science are not the faculties that will take us there, but other faculties. And even those modern thinkers who rejected the idea of progress altogether did not escape the paradigm, since they did not offer other solutions to what man should aspire to. All they could do is say that man has no hope for happiness, or propose going back to old solutions, like religious faith. Thus, they were still affirming the paradigm. Let's take for example the Dada movement in art. Dada was born during World War I, when the modern paradigm was shaken to its core. The Dadaists could no longer believe in the idea of progress, so they ridiculed it in any way possible. The main idea of Dada was destroying the hierarchy of the modern thought. The modern paradigm, like any other paradigm, created a hierarchy that ranked everything in spectrums of good to bad, beautiful to ugly, important to trivial, refined to vulgar, meaningful to meaningless, and so forth. Dada just took the highs and the lows of these spectrums and mixed them together to invalidate the hierarchy. But most artists could never stay long in this chaotic stage. For the next few decades, there were many Dada moments in which artists found new ways to subvert the modern hierarchy. But it always resulted in a new movement that thought it found the way to present the truth about human existence, and thus help progress. It lasted until the 1970s, and since then, there are no more Dada moments. Why? Because the modern paradigm collapsed, so Dada became pointless. Dada, the disruptor of modern logic, had power and meaning only as long as we were in the modern paradigm. The moderns didn't know that they were in the modern paradigm. The way they saw it, humans have always believed in fairy tales and superstitions, until the Enlightenment came, and since then we are on the path towards freeing ourselves from these superstitions and discovering the truth. In the process, we are also becoming better and more moral, gradually creating a perfect human society. Everything, then, was judged by the measuring rod of how it helps our progress towards that goal. In this paradigm, dialectic thought was born. Dialectic thought was the first to present the idea of the paradigm, although they didn't call it that, and there are some essential differences between what postmodernism calls the paradigm and what Marx, the most famous dialectic thinker, calls the superstructure. But let's call it paradigm. The claim of dialectic thought is that every period is ruled by a paradigm, which divides humans into a dominant class and a subordinate class. But eventually, a better paradigm is created, and the subordinate class brings a revolution and imposes a new paradigm. This new paradigm is truer and less oppressive, but it is still imperfect, and still divides society into a dominant and subordinate class. This is how progress is made, and at the end of the road all the contradictions will be settled, and society will no longer be built on a paradigm but on the truth, and will have no classes. At the end of the 19th century, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche poked holes in the modern paradigm. Contemporary humans, he wrote, are making the mistake of thinking that humans have always been the same, so when they look back at history they see it as linear progress. But if we examine the development of our language, we will realize that the concepts we are using went through transformations over the years, and meant other things in the past. What we think are eternal truths are merely what our current concepts lead us to think. And, starting from the late 1950s, Michel Foucault combined the influence of Nietzsche with influence from dialectic thought, to lay the ground for postmodernist philosophy. Michel Foucault called himself a historian of ideas, since what he was exploring was how our ideas develop and change. He agreed with Marx that history moves from one period to the other, and every period has its own paradigm, or episteme as he called it. But while Marx believed that he found a universal principle that determines all period changes, and could therefore predict the future, Foucault said that this belief was merely determined by the modern paradigm that Marx was in. There is no rule by which the changes occur, so there is no point in looking for it. Instead, Foucault said that the historian of ideas should work like an archaeologist. He should try to unearth the paradigms of previous periods, and delineate the logic that ruled them. He should also trace the changes of ideas within a period, leading to the moment when these ideas caused the paradigm shift. In this way we can understand these periods better, and as a result, understand our period better as well, as we will see how our ideas developed and took the current form. So, unlike a dialectic like Marx, Foucault is not deterministic. They would both agree that theories like those of Darwin and Freud could only be born within the modern paradigm, but while Marx would believe that such theories are truer than previous theories, and made possible because the modern paradigm took us to a more advanced place from which we can uncover those truths, for Foucault it is much less certain. When a paradigm changes, there is also something lost, and paths that could have led to scientific discoveries are being closed. And while Marx would believe that it is inevitable that Darwin's theory would be formulated, for Foucault there is a lot of chance involved in the process. If by chance an alternative evolutionary theory was presented instead of Darwin's, history would have taken a different direction. One interesting thing about Foucault is that in exploring the history of ideas, he did not focus on philosophers. Instead, he shifted his look towards fields of practical thought, such as medicine and law enforcement, or towards scientific fields like biology. He shows that the changes in these fields have repeatedly transformed our perception of what reason is, our perception of what life is, our perception of what man is, and our perception of many other concepts which we erroneously think have always meant the same. These changes also change our perception of what justice, freedom, and equality mean, so philosophers must then come up with new theories. Thus it is these practical and scientific concepts that are the main driving force of the history of ideas, and the philosophers follow. Which means that philosophy isn't really progressing towards finding the truth, but is merely working within what is allowed by the concepts of the time, by the paradigm. The whole modern story of progress, then, is undermined in Foucault's work. We've been looking at previous periods and nodding our head at the senseless ideas and brutal treatment of humans displayed in them, and we pride ourselves for being more knowledgeable and humane. Foucault's archaeological research shows that when we put these ideas and actions in the context of the paradigm that we're in, they make sense and seem rational and moral. So what we actually have is not progress, but a shift of paradigms. There is of course progress in our practical knowledge, which allows us to make human life better and longer, but the modern belief that we are progressing towards the truth, or becoming morally better, is revealed as naive. The conclusion, then, is that philosophy should change its outlook. Modern philosophy, especially the dialectic tradition which Foucault came from, was busy trying to figure out the law that governs the progress of man. Thinkers were examining history, and looking to unearth a universal principle that can be detected as the cause of all the changes. Finding this principle would supposedly enable us to figure out how to get to the perfect state, and once we figured that out, we can speed up the progress towards it. But Foucault's archaeological research shows that, as Nietzsche claimed, it is pointless to look for such a law. Instead, Foucault says that we should focus on the present. All we can do as philosophers is try to figure out the paradigm that we are in, and thus liberate our mind from the control it has over it. In the revolutionary atmosphere of the late 1960s, it seemed like the revolution of the proletariat, which the Marxists so yearned for, was about to happen, especially in France. Foucault was part of the radical left, but he did not believe in the Marxist utopia. Instead, he started to look into the power structures in society and examine how they establish themselves. He showed that, contrary to what the Marxists believed, the power is not all in the hands of the ruling class, and is not imposed from above by power institutions like the police and the army. It is rather dispersed throughout society, maintained in large part by all the institutions that hold the knowledge, whether theoretical or practical. All the different power and knowledge institutions are in interplay, affecting each other, creating a grid through which power relations are set and the paradigm is maintained. Which means that any change made in any of the points on this grid will have a ripple effect that will cause changes elsewhere. So, instead of going for a total revolution, we can focus on a single point and cause change through it. And that gives individuals and groups a lot more power than the Marxists claim they have. After the revolutionary drums of the late 60s quieted down, Foucault started to talk about resisting the system on the individual level. The role of the philosopher is to help expose the paradigm that rules our minds, so that individuals and groups can escape the power it has over them, and create their own ideas and ways of life. Thus, greater freedom is achieved. In the late 70s, as philosophers were starting to talk about postmodernism, Foucault was considered one of its main prophets. But he rejected the term. He claimed that what he was doing, focusing on the present instead of the future, is actually the logical conclusion of the modern paradigm. The belief in a perfect future society, he claimed, was just a relic from the classical age that remained in modern thought. So what he was doing was actually being a real modern, whereas Marx was a modern who did not fully free himself from the classical belief that a man can find the perfect order. This view, however, was not accepted. Unlike Foucault, who focused on the processes that are unconscious to us, most thinkers focused on the conscious part of the modern age, the convictions that were driving it, and realized that we lost our belief in those convictions, which means that the modern age is dead. The main philosopher making this claim was Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard lays it down in a 1979 book called The Postmodern Condition. It is basically a long essay, in which he outlines the collapse of the modern agenda, and asks how we should react to this situation. He points out that in the modern age, the belief was that we are working to free our culture of narratives, and base it instead on truths, believing that this will liberate humanity and create a perfect society. But now we realize that all of this, the belief in progress towards utopia, the belief in the dialectic process, the belief that science and philosophy give us a truth, the belief that we are liberating ourselves, were themselves just narratives, or rather meta-narratives. Western culture accepted these meta-narratives as self-evident, so any statement that relied on them for legitimacy was seen as valid. But now, all these meta-narratives have collapsed, and there's nothing that we can rely on for legitimacy. All that is left are competing narratives. What we have now are many language games, each with its own rules. As long as you and I are within a certain language game, we will accept each other's statements as legitimate if that's what the rules of the game dictate. But they will not be seen as legitimate by someone from a different language game. These language games are all intertwined, and there is no accepted meta-language to determine which one is truer. And this has some negative repercussions. First, since truth is no longer perceived as the liberator of humanity, language games that pursue truth, like science and philosophy, have to find different ways to justify themselves. Scientific research is supported only as long as it can show it has functional value for the system or the market. And, even more troubling, we have no criteria to tell us what is right and what is good. So how do we deal with this situation? The first thing to do, says Lyotard, is to realize that there is no way out of it. We should acknowledge that we are in this society where there is no universally accepted hierarchy of knowledge, but just many intertwined language games. Those who want to research something that is not seen as functional by the system must invent ways to make the fields attractive. And as for morality, while it is true that it is dangerous that we don't have a clear criterion, it is also a blessing. In the modern age, when good was perceived as anything that helps our progress towards a perfect society, movements like fascism and communism could present themselves as the embodiment of that progress, and justify imposing their will on others by force. In a postmodern society, where there are no meta-narratives, it becomes a lot harder to justify such totalitarian positions and actions. So just like Foucault, Lyotard points out that power has been dispersed across the grid, creating a complex network, and the hope is that this makes society more durable against immoral movements. We don't have a meta-narrative to disqualify bad ideas, but we have the freedom to create better ideas, and the nature of our open society will see to it that these ideas win. If we take a contemporary example, today the West is dealing with the threat of Islamism, and it may seem that Islamism is stronger, as it has much clearer convictions. But as Islamism entered this battle, it made Islam part of the Western grid, which means that it opened it to the infiltration of many new ideas, narratives and language games, which will eat away at these convictions. Ultimately, the hope is that this pluralistic grid will win. The question is, do you believe in the durability of this grid? I happen to do. I believe that most people want to live a free and peaceful life, and want it for their fellow humans as well. So in a free marketplace of ideas, the good ideas will eventually triumph. And because of this optimism, I am not afraid of the postmodern world. So far, what we can say about the postmodern age is that it has been the most peaceful and prosperous time the West has ever known. It may have been responsible for producing many silly and harmful ideas, but they always got defeated before they caused any serious damage. Whereas truly harmful ideas that have been inherited from previous ages, like communism or religious fundamentalism, have lost power when put into the postmodern grinder. It may be too early to judge, but so far, so good. So what then is the problem with postmodernism? Why does it have such a bad rep? Well, until now we have mainly been defining the postmodern condition, and showed that it arises from the collapse of the modern paradigm, which left us with no universally accepted way to determine what is true and what is good. But postmodernist philosophy doesn't just define the condition, it also tries to offer ways to deal with it. And here, while Foucault and Lyotard's suggestions are generally measured and reasonable, their followers drew very different conclusions, which led to some negative results. So let's examine what they are. First of all, as we learned from Foucault, everything is subject to change, and all the things that we think are essential to us have been different in the past, which means that humans are infinitely malleable, and nothing in us is essential to our character. And that leads to the belief that we are born a blank slate, and our character can be shaped in any way that society sees fit. But that is not the right conclusion. If we go back to Nietzsche, he also believed that humans are malleable, and he even believed that we can change our biology if we change our way of thinking. But he did not see humans as a blank slate. We are all carrying the baggage of our biology that evolved over millions of years, and our culture that developed over millennia. If a man had 80,000 years to live, says Nietzsche, then he would be able to change everything about his character. In other words, everything is malleable and nothing is essential, but because we are shaped by humanity's past, the amount of change we can implement at a single moment is very limited. Foucault did not deal with the biological level and remained on the ideological level, but he implies the same thing. We are born into a paradigm, so any change can only be within the parameters of what this paradigm allows. There is no basis, in the writings of Foucault, to the belief that we can shape humans as we wish. Another conclusion that is wrongly drawn out of Foucault's philosophy is that our reason is oppressive and should be destroyed. Foucault, as we said, shows that our concepts developed in an arbitrary way, and could have developed differently, which means that they are denying us the freedom to think differently. This argument is more commonly associated with the third big name of postmodernism, Jacques Derrida. I did not talk about Derrida because I am not familiar enough with his work. I intend to make other videos about postmodernism in the future, and by then I will remedy the situation. You see, one does not read Derrida if one does not have a good reason to read Derrida. And now I have that reason. But judging by the little I read, I think that it is wrong to accuse even him of this idea that our reason should be destroyed. It is true that there is something oppressive about our reason. It must be, or we won't be able to survive. For example, our reason categorizes different things together under the same label. That is why when we see a lion that we never saw before, we are still able to recognize that this is a lion, and know that we should run away. So that's how our mind works, but that also means that we are erasing individual differences, and thus our reason is oppressive towards individuals. But does that mean that we should discard it? Of course not. Let's go back to Nietzsche. A large part of his writing is dedicated to show that the foundations of our reason are not transcendental truths, like philosophers used to believe, but developed in an evolutionary process. But, he says, that is no reason to give it up. If it developed in an evolutionary process over millions of years, then it is a good instrument. We should realize that our reason is not perfect. We should criticize it and try to make it better, but we should never give it up. This is also what Foucault, and I believe Derrida as well, are saying. The criticism and deconstruction of our reason is meant to expose its oppressive sides, to open up the way for individuals and groups who want to think differently, but it is not meant to destroy it. Some of the followers, however, don't understand this distinction, and so Western reason is under attack. For Nietzsche, freedom from wasn't very important. What he cared about was freedom to. By creating a new way of thinking, you are creating a new powerful and joyful way of life. Once the new way of thinking sets in and becomes established, says Nietzsche, then you start to fight against it, and try to create an even more powerful way of thinking. But Foucault and Derrida were not interested in feeling power. Power, for them, was all bad, so their attacks on established thought were not aimed at establishing new ways of thought, but only at opening up the way for new ways of thought to emerge. That's the main reason for the poetic language of the postmodernists. They were terrified of the idea that their thought will become an oppressive doctrine, so they made it open to many interpretations. But something gets lost when you do that. While Nietzsche inspires you to realize your full potential, the postmodernists, especially Derrida and his disciples, reduce everything to triviality. When your philosophy is only about freedom from, you are not developing your spiritual powers. And that's one of the main negative effects postmodernism has on our culture. Those are the main inherent problems in postmodernism. But the bigger problem is not with postmodernist thought itself, but with how it makes us vulnerable to other ways of thinking. Most of all, how it helps those who still hold on to modern Marxist dialectic thought. Instead of accepting the postmodernist criticism and realizing that it invalidates dialectic thought, many Marxists simply appropriated it and are using postmodernist rhetoric as a shield and a weapon. What we call the regressive left are mainly people who pretend to be postmodernists when they are actually neo-Marxists, and they are the ones who are responsible for most of its bad reputation. Let's take feminism as an example. The Marxist feminist approach is to claim that women were always an oppressed class, and they use examples from history as evidence. Now, if you take Foucault's archaeological approach and examine the gender relations in the context of the paradigm of the time, you realize that the picture is a lot more complicated. You will find that women always had power, and that a lot of the customs that today we deem sexist were actually created with the intent of protecting women. Analyzing and understanding these dynamics can help us improve the relations between the genders. Alas, that is not what regressive feminists are doing. Instead, they are using postmodernism to claim that Western reason is nothing but a narrative, and present the feminist narrative as a superior alternative. Now, in postmodernist logic, it is indeed valid to say that Western reason is a narrative, but there is no justification to claim that any narrative is better. But the regressive feminists are relying on dialectic thought, in which, as we recall, the oppressed group is the one that represents the next step in the progress towards utopia, and therefore its narrative is superior. Other regressives from so-called oppressed groups are doing the same thing, claiming their narrative to be superior to the Western narrative by the sheer fact that they are oppressed. And since our culture still contains enough residue from the modern age, this way of thinking holds sway with many people. Worse, the relativism of postmodernism leads many regressives to argue that they don't need to rely on facts when creating their narratives. Again, that is the opposite of what Foucault espoused. His archaeological approach was always based on facts. When you create a new narrative based on universally accepted facts, it has power, and can help a marginalized group gain more power and acceptance. But those who still believe that history is governed by the dialectic process think that the main goal should be ensuring victory for the oppressed group, and that this end justifies all means. Thus, they create narratives that have maximum emotional power, but very little connection to facts. The result is that no one else accepts these narratives, so they have no power to change things, and only serve to marginalize the groups they are trying to help. Foucault and Derrida, as we mentioned, did not want to bring down Western reason. The idea is just to acknowledge that it developed in a historical process, and may have proved itself to be good, but it is not the one and only truth, and there is oppressive power involved in maintaining it. With this realization, we open up space for thinking differently. But if you are still stuck in dialectic thought, then you believe that Western reason is a superstructure that prevents us from achieving utopia, and has to be overthrown. Derrida's deconstruction techniques that then become an instrument not to make Western culture more pluralistic, but to destroy it altogether, believing that this will open up the way for a better alternative. Some regressives thus do not make an attempt to create new ways of thinking, but just try to destroy Western thought. The result is nihilism. The road to postmodernism was opened when the modern paradigm collapsed. That happened because the paradigm could no longer justify itself. Modern thought, in its zeal to find the truth, has exposed the shaky ground on which its own maxims stood, and made them crumble. But there were also events that helped it happen. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan, and the Cold War, made it seem like the world could end at any minute, and made the idea of progress seem hollow. The Holocaust made the notion that modern progress is turning us into better people seem like a sick joke, and the catastrophic failure of the communist states showed dialectic thought to be nothing but fancy wishful thinking. The project of enlightenment was meant to create a better human society, where people are more refined and civilized, and use the advancements of science and technology to create a better life for us all. Now, in the decades after World War II, it seemed like all it did was give them bigger weapons to create more havoc, and even to destroy the entire species. And in such an atmosphere of disillusionment, postmodernism could flourish. In the 1990s, however, the Cold War ended peacefully, and the world entered a period of working to solve its problems. Since then, confidence in the ideals of enlightenment has been growing again, and we have started to look at the horrors of the 20th century as anomalies in what is essentially a success story. And so, postmodernism is now under attack for what is perceived as its anti-enlightenment stance. However, when it comes to offering a way out of postmodernism, I am not really seeing anyone suggesting any good solutions. A good example for that is a book written by Stephen Hicks called Stephen Hicks, and the book is called Explaining Postmodernism. In contrast with the postmodernists, Hicks expands the definition of the modern period, to include the classical period as well. For him, the modern period begins with the 17th century philosophers of enlightenment, who believed that the universe obeys laws that can be deciphered by human reason. The way he sees it, modern thought started to go astray when, in late 18th century, philosophers began to doubt that human reason can totally understand the universe. Hicks calls this stance anti-reason, and provides a historical account of how it led Western thought to put more and more limits on what human reason can know, until we got to the relativism of postmodernism. His solution is to go back to the belief in the power of reason to understand the universe, and find ways to bolster that belief against those who try to undermine it. Hicks's narrative is a legitimate way of explaining the history of Western thought. The problem is that in the process, he does exactly what he blames postmodernism of. First, he asks us to take a leap of faith, and accept the idea that human reason can understand the universe, even after all the arguments it stood on have been debunked. Secondly, he does not refute the arguments of those philosophers he goes against, but rather deconstructs them, and claims that the real motivation of these philosophers was not the pursuit of truth but other reasons, such as saving religion. That is not a good answer for how we can defeat the bad repercussions of postmodernism. I reject Hicks's characterization of these philosophers as anti-reason. They were working in the name of reason, and reason cannot accept leaps of faith. The pursuit of truth led to the realization that there is nothing to support the belief that human reason can establish true statements about the universe. After that realization, it would actually be anti-reason to continue to believe in what Hicks wants us to believe. Just like there's no going back to blind faith in the existence of God, there's also no going back to blind faith in reason's ability to figure out the truth. We are in the postmodern reality, and we have to find a solution in it. So, allow me to present my solution. My claim is that the Academy is about 100 years behind the times, and that all this debate around modernism and postmodernism has no connection with the reality of most people. We have indeed been living in a new age since the 1960s, and I call this age the pop age. The reason the Academy is not in tune is that it disregards what is happening in pop culture, the main place where the Western spirit expressed itself in the past century. Modernist and postmodernist philosophers alike, when discussing today's culture, are still talking about painters and poets and playwrights, which no one knows about outside of their little snobbish circle. When you look at pop culture, however, a completely different paradigm emerges. The first thing that you notice is that we are no longer dreaming of a perfect society. Our society is already good enough, and we can discuss ways of making it better, but progress is no longer something that occupies our collective consciousness. So rather than revolutionizing the system, we are looking for revolutions of the mind, breaking out of our current way of thinking and discovering new thoughts, new experiences, new worlds. It is very much in line with what Foucault suggests, the idea that we always try to expose the paradigm and break out of it. But there is something that Foucault, and all the other postmodernists, had missed. What they had missed is that throughout history, people who thought that they discovered the truth have reported that this discovery was accompanied by a strong ecstatic sensation, a feeling of being engulfed by light. Now, if we no longer believe that it is possible for humans to discover the truth, then we have to ask ourselves, how do we account for these ecstatic sensations? If it wasn't due to connecting with the universal and eternal truth, then what was it? And the answer must be that they have found the truth of their time, the thing that at that moment felt more real than anything else. Nietzsche's philosophy was all about this sensation, about the ecstasy that you experience when you break out of your old way of thinking and create a new way of thinking that feels more powerful and real. Foucault may have adopted Nietzsche's philosophy of repeated regeneration, but he left out the ecstasy part. In pop culture, this ecstasy is the main thing, and it is expressed mainly through music. Previously, we mentioned Dada as an example for a modernist movement. Dada was born in 1916, brought to life by a small theatre troupe called Cabaret Voltaire, operating in Zurich. A year later, in America, the original Dixieland Jazz Band released what are considered to be the first jazz records. We are listening to a record called Library Stable Blues, which has the same iconoclastic spirit as Dada. The combination of musical sounds with barnyard sounds was scandalous at the time, bringing into art something that does not belong to it, just like Dada was doing. But while the art of Cabaret Voltaire has become completely meaningless to us now, those early jazz recordings still have power. The ecstasy is still there, etched into the grooves of the records, bursting with energy and anarchic mirth. Those ecstatic sensations of music could not be captured until recording technology was invented, but from the moment it became good enough to record music, a new consciousness could be born, a consciousness that revolves around these sensations, the consciousness of pop. And in this new consciousness, a new definition of truth was formed. The fans of every musical style would distinguish between true manifestations of the style and false manifestations of it, between real jazz and fake jazz, real blues and fake blues, real rock and roll and fake rock and roll, real funk and fake funk, etc. Every musical style had its own unique ecstatic sensation, and the music had to convey it to be considered real. Every musical style was the basis for a lifestyle and a group identity, and one had to have an inner understanding of the truth of the style to be considered a real member of the group. And every musical style could remain real only for a limited period of time, the period when it still conveyed the truth of the time. At some point it would lose its vitality, and newer and truer styles would become the part of pop culture. Throughout the 20th century, pop was a succession of musical styles, each constituting the truth of its time. And through this constant rejuvenation, Western culture could beat back the rise of anti-freedom movements, those that believed that they spoke for an eternal and universal truth and tried to impose it on everyone. Pop consecrated joy and fun, and that made it more powerful than any of these movements. In modern thought, truth is universal and eternal, and the enlightened man is the one who sees the truth, or at least an idea that is more advanced and truthful. The system holds the most advanced accumulated knowledge created by these educated men, so it can devise the best society according to that knowledge, and impose it on all of us. In pop, truth is something that emerges from the spirit of the time, existing in the collective consciousness. In other words, it cannot be imposed from above, but emerges from below. So while Marxism talked about seizing the means of production to give economic power to the masses, in pop we talk about seizing the means of producing culture, so that everyone gets a say and we have a truly free marketplace of ideas. The history of pop is a history of making the means of producing culture more available to the masses. YouTube, where we can create videos and share them with the entire world for almost no financial cost, is one of the latest products of this process. One interesting video you can find on YouTube is the 1971 debate between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, which I will link to below. You should watch it, if only to check out whether now, after watching my video, you are able to grasp what Foucault is saying. The interesting thing about this debate is that it is between the modern thinker Chomsky, who believes that our mind is governed by universal structures which are part of our human nature, and the postmodernist Foucault, who believes that these structures are temporary social constructs. In one part they talk about the imminent workers' revolution, and Chomsky believes it should be done in the name of eternal values of justice, whereas Foucault is cynical about it and claims that such a revolution will change the paradigm, which means that our perception of justice will change, so we don't know whether the revolution will make things better or worse. Therefore, he says, he can't justify a revolution. But this debate was already archaic, because during the 1960s, the consciousness of pop has already taken over a large part of the Western population, and their minds were no longer ruled by the modern paradigm. In the same year, 1971, The Who released the single Won't Get Fooled Again, which tells about a bloody revolution breaking out. The singer knows that past revolutions have failed to fulfill their promises, but believes that this time it will be different. This time we will get utopia. And when the battle is over and the new order prevails, he goes out to see what has changed, and finds that meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The Who tell us that there is no such thing as utopia, and many other rock songs of the time express the same sentiment, the realization that revolutions are pointless. We already live in the best possible system, the liberal democratic system, and any revolution will only make things worse. Instead, pop culture focuses on making the best out of the now. In the second half of the 70s, punk brought Dada into the mainstream, mixing together the beautiful with the ugly, the profane with the sacred, the organic with the industrial. This was the coup de grace for the modern world. With street fashion taken over by the Dada taste, and with the airwaves full of iconoclastic punk bands singing that there is no future and we should focus on the now, the modern paradigm was shattered. From then on, we have been living inside the pop paradigm. In the late 1990s, there has been a shift inside the pop world, brought on mainly by the internet. 20th century pop music was so powerful because it was a way to express a truth that was suppressed by mainstream culture, in a way that could break through and reach the ears of others who felt the same. With the internet, however, you could publicly express your truth and find others who feel the same without the mediation of music. So music lost its power, and the focus today is not so much on expressing truth. Instead, what we are busy with today is the creation of new worlds, where people can coalesce around a shared interest or experience and develop an entire universe on top of it. With virtual reality and augmented reality becoming a thing, we can imagine a future in which the so-called real world will be just a platform, and most of our time will be spent in worlds we choose to inhabit, and even find our employment in. There aren't many problems left to solve in our original world, but our created worlds could offer us endless puzzles to work on. This reality, however, is still mostly in the future, waiting for the world of video games to advance until it can create it. And with music losing power, this leaves a vacuum, and makes pop culture a bit weak at the moment. Someone had to step into the breach, and it is the video creators who step forward. We YouTubers are now the vanguard of pop culture, the place where the spirit of the time dwells. I mean, Greg so pop, he's dating Minnie Mouse. And that also means that we are the shield that protects Western culture from bad ideas. As Lyotard says, the philosophers must find their place in a postmodern world that seemingly has no use for them anymore. I find YouTube to be the best place for a philosopher today, the place where I can analyze contemporary art and explicate the spirit of the time, the place where I can criticize today's culture, and the place where I can, through interaction with bigger channels, get my thoughts through. Layman, my biggest criticism of you is that you expect too much from the Skeptosphere. It is not an intellectual movement, it is a pop subculture. But it is a subculture that has turned skepticism into something cool, which allows academics like us to have a say. Alright, I guess I've given you some food for thought there. I normally try not to make my videos very long, because my style is to cram a lot of information into every paragraph, so I try not to overload your system with too many paragraphs. But in this video, I wanted to provide a full picture that will give you at least a basic understanding of the issue of postmodernism in philosophy. I hope I was clear enough to make things clearer for you guys. If I wasn't, pardon my French.